For some 150 years, from the late 18th century to the early 20th, Western civilization reached its manufacturing and industrial zenith, and much of the work burdened to that end was on the backs of European children. Whether it was sharecropping, coal breaking, spindle pushing, chimney sweeping, or wire bending, in textile mills, mines, cotton fields, metal firing yards, or the cold cranberry marshes of the American Northeast, the slave labor of European children advanced the modern world into the present age with pitiless toil, fear, and blood. This period ended in the mid-20th century, but much of the wealth that the West accumulated was due to the millions of unskilled jobs these children filled. 15-hour days, no breaks, pissing your pants where you stood, all the while praying you didn't lose another finger. That is some kind of privilege. Meanwhile, the entire globe benefited as the impetus of industrialization spread across the world, bringing many cultures out of the Stone Age. But for some of you who may be skeptical, preferring statistical data and referencing, we make this case in point. The Irish slave trade began when 30,000 Irish prisoners were sold as slaves to the New World. The King James Proclamation of 1625 required Irish political prisoners to be sent overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. By the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to the West Indies and British North America. Ireland quickly became the biggest source of human livestock for English merchantry. The majority of the early slaves to the New World were actually white. From 1641 to 52, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell about 70% in one decade. Families were ripped apart as the British did not allow Irish dads to take their wives and children with them across the Atlantic. This led to a helpless population of homeless women and children. Britain's solution was to auction them off as well. During the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children between the ages of 9 and 13 were taken from their parents and sold as slaves in the West Indies and to British North America, primarily Virginia and New England. In this decade, 80,000 Irish, mostly women and children, were sold to Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irishmen and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. In 1656, Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be sent to Jamaica yearly and sold as slaves to English settlers. Many people today will avoid calling the Irish slaves what they truly were, slaves. They'll come up with terms like indentured servants to describe what occurred to the Irish. However, in most cases from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, Irish slaves were nothing more than human cattle. African slaves were very expensive during the late 1600s, about 50 sterling for a healthy young man. Irish slaves came cheap, no more than 5 sterling. If a planter branded or beat an Irish slave to death, it was never a crime. A death was a monetary setback, but far cheaper than killing a more expensive African. The English masters quickly began breeding the Irish women for both their own personal pleasure and for greater profit. Children of slaves were themselves slaves, which increased the size of the master's free workforce. Even if an Irish woman somehow obtained her freedom, her kids would remain slaves of her master. Therefore, Irish moms, even with this newfound emancipation, would seldom abandon their kids and would remain in servitude in perpetuity. So, in summation, 99.9% of Europeans living in the West are the descendants of working-class poor and slaves. There is no such thing as white privilege, and whatever things we have in our lives now, we are entitled to them, as they are the fruit of our many previous generations' blood and toil.